So I'm Carrie Kinney, the new executive director of the Freeport Conservation Trust, and we are all here tonight to talk about invasives. I would ask if you're just jumping on, if you can mute during the presentation, that would be great. If there's a question during the presentation or a comment you want to make while it's going on, while Amanda's talking, if you put it in the chat, I'll grab it and make some notes and kind of combine some discussion, and we can do a question and answer afterwards, if that's okay. I am recording this. We are recording this and we will probably post it. We're working on a new website, so we might wait until the website's up, but we'll share the recording with you. And as Amanda said earlier, she has a lot more resources and we can share a bunch of links with you. So that's kind of the format. So many of you are from Freeport and know this, but Freeport Conservation Trust is a community-based organization celebrating this year the 45th anniversary, which is really, really old in the land trust world, I have to say. It's pretty remarkable. This organization has conserved over 2,700 acres and maintains over 20 miles of trails within the town of Freeport. So that's pretty remarkable. We completely rely on community support from individual families and foundations. So many of you have supported FCT and we really appreciate that. So on to why we are here. I am pleased to introduce Amanda Devine, who lives here in Freeport and also serves on the FCT Stewardship Committee. Professionally, Amanda serves as Regional Steward Manager for the Maine Coast Heritage Trust. Her background is in biology from Bates College, and then she did her master's in botany at UVM. She served as a naturalist and guide at Denali National Park. And somehow through all of that, her experience has led her to be a real, I would say expert, but a real specialty in invasive terrestrial plant management. Not easy for me to say. So we appreciate Amanda coming, and I would also, you will also, after this presentation in the next day or so, maybe the first of next week, get an invite. We will be having a field component to this workshop on June 4th at 1 p.m. at our new Walsh Preserve on Old County Road. There is plenty invasives to look at there. And so if you want on the ground kind of experience with to touch and feel and look and discuss, that will be June 4th at 1 p.m. And we will ask for reservations for that, just to get a clue of how many people we've got coming. So thank you, Amanda, for taking time out of your busy schedule. I know it's just gearing up and helping us become educated and informed on what invasives are and what we can do.
Thanks for that nice introduction, Carrie, and thank you all for joining me. It's a beautiful evening, and I appreciate the fact that we're all looking at a screen to try to learn more together. I have a presentation here with some slides, and there's going to be plenty of time for questions and answers. I don't mind getting into the nitty-gritty of how do I kill this with that at this time of year, but we'll save that for the end. What I'm going to talk a little bit about is why invasive plants are problematic, big picture and small, who they are, kind of who our dirty dozen is, and then talk about management strategies. And as Carrie said, I do this professionally, but I also do this personally as a Freeport resident. In 2018, I bought a little house and about an 11-acre buckthorn plantation. And so when I'm not out killing plants as a professional, I am home killing plants as a homeowner with homeowner tools. And so I really want to gear this presentation to you folks who probably have a patch of this or a patch of that. You're not necessarily professional land managers. So I'm going to try to make this really useful to everybody. And I want to thank you for being here and for caring. So I'm going to do a screen share here. Let's see. And can I just get a confirmation? Carrie, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. And does my audio sound okay?
I have a headset on, but for me, yes.
Okay.
It does.
Yep.
All
That
right.
sounds great.
Great, thank you all. So as Carrie said, my name's Amanda Devine. I live here in Freeport on the Pownell line, and I would call myself a botanist by training. I've been in the land conservation world since 2007. And as Carrie said, I was a naturalist and guide before that. So I really like to get paid for walking around outdoors and looking at plants. As we all develop professionally, it's a little naive to think that I could just make money looking at cool plants. And so I've sort of developed myself into an invasive plant manager. I don't call myself an expert. I am constantly learning. The more of this I do, the more I realize that there's a depth and breadth of knowledge out there shared by other folks that I'm just beginning to scratch the surface of. But I have been doing this for a while and I have learned a lot along the way. So I want to share with you what I have learned, recognizing that I'm not by any means an expert or the definitive voice here. And really what sort of woke me up to this is, as a person who loves plants, I'm a plant dork. I just want to walk around and look at plants. It was really over the years becoming alarmed at how the species that we're going to be talking about tonight alter habitats and displace the native plants that are really the underpinning for pretty much the rest of our ecosystem. So what are invasive plants? Anybody you ask is probably going to give you a different definition and a whole different suite of species that they find particularly pesty. I really like the Maine Natural Areas Program definition, and they describe an invasive plant as a plant that is not native to a particular ecosystem, whose introduction does or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And I will just hold up the Maine Natural Areas Program as a really excellent reference for those of you who want to dig deeper on invasive plants in Maine. So as I alluded to in the previous slide, invasive is really in the eye of the beholder. So there's about 3,700 vascular plant species growing without cultivation in New England. And 1,000 of those species, about 1,000, are introduced. And that means that they started appearing since European colonization. And of course, I just want to take a step back and tip my hat to the fact that species are always moving. If you imagine New England under miles of ice 18,000 years ago, everything that moved into our region was a colonizer. So everything is changing. There's no static ecosystem, but the plants that we're talking about are very recent on the scene. In Maine, there's about 2,100 plant species that are growing without cultivation, and about a third of these 700 species are not native. So we have comparatively fewer non-native species in Maine than in the rest of New England, but we still have a big chunk. Now, of those that aren't native, about 70 species, or 10% are considered invasive or potentially invasive. So I'm talking capital I invasive now. Now, the term invasive itself is a bit controversial. I actually just today with a coworker had a conversation and he said, I don't like staghorn sumac because it's invasive. Well, staghorn sumac is a native plant and it's really good at colonizing disturbed areas, but to some people it's weedy. Speckled alder, wrinkle-leaved goldenrod, poison ivy, gray birch, hay-scented fern. These are all native species. They're aggressive colonizers, but they play valuable roles, ecologically speaking, and they don't tend to take hold for long periods the way non-native invasives do. So I want to differentiate between what some people might call weeds and what some people would call invasive, and what we are talking about tonight, which is capital N non-native, capital I invasive plants. There's only about a dozen of those that are really problematic. And of course, if you're a farmer or a gardener, you have a whole different suite of species that are weeds that are problematic to you. Burdock, which is the plant photo shown in the far right there, is a pesky agricultural weed. It's not native. I don't even bat an eyelash when I see burdock on the lands that I manage because I'm not a farmer. I'm not growing produce. I don't have sheep that are getting tangled up in the wool. So to me, that's not a problem. Now, over on the far left, that's black swallowwort, which we'll talk a little bit more about. That's one of what I call the dirty dozen, the capital I invasives that are really problematic, that are non-native. And then in the middle, we have poison ivy here, which is native. I have people contact me, people learn that I'm good at managing plants, and they say, how do I deal with my poison ivy? Well, poison ivy is native and it produces these waxy little white berries that are a great food source for birds. So it's just important to take a step back and think about what's the plant doing? What's the problem it's causing? I mean, a weed is basically any plant out of place. So I like to get a little bit philosophical about that before I dig into the weeds, so to speak. Sorry, I won't use that pun again. So characteristics, what makes these plants, these roughly dirty dozen that we're talking about, so problematic? Why do they take over? The fact is, as terrible as they are, they're actually really quite admirable on the whole. They are really good at being plants. So generally speaking, these species leaf out sooner. And in fact, the honeysuckle right around us is just starting to break bud. You can see it on the side of the road with just the littlest bit of hint of green coming out. So it's photosynthetically got a jump on the competition. They tend to have a wider range of growing conditions that they can tolerate. I've seen Morrow's honeysuckle growing in full shade, in part shade, in full sun, in the edge of wetlands, in dry areas. So they have a very wide, what you would call an ecological amplitude. They can make a living lots of places. And they're generally good at jumping into disturbed areas and using nutrients efficiently. So they're good at being plants. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. They also are really good at making other plants. Their reproductive capacity is pretty significant. This is a picture of multiflora rose here. And if you see this one go to seed or go produce fruits, there's tons of little tiny rose hips, and I do mean tons. A lot of times these species flower and fruit early in their life cycle. They're great at dispersing. Oftentimes these species have a very long life in the soil seed bank. Bittersweet seeds can persist in the soil for up to 10 years, which is not too shabby when you think about it. They're sometimes good at vegetative reproduction. So Japanese knotweed is the poster child for fragments being able to, or fragments that contain the leaf nodes being able to sprout from those nodes. That's been a little bit overplayed over the years. Recent studies have shown that it's not quite as good as we think, but it certainly can still travel that way vegetatively. And oftentimes they are not eaten by native wildlife. And by that, I mean the vegetative part, the leaves and the shoots. Most of the times the fruits and the seeds are gobbled up, especially by birds. And that is one primary way that these species spread. So thank you, birds. So why are they so problematic? Why are these plants so bad? We have, as I said before, we've got about 70 species in Maine that are considered invasive, but there's really just a subset of these that are truly ecologically problematic. The big picture is the primary issue is that they outcompete and they take over where native plants should be. And this can fundamentally change habitat, very often, usually to the detriment of other native species. These plants aren't evil and they are better than, say, a shopping mall complex. So they provide some ecological benefit. I mean, there's still some food for wildlife here, but they don't provide anywhere near the same amount of benefit that an intact natural ecosystem does. Also, a number of these species, and Japanese barberry, which is shown in this slide, this is from a nature preserve in Scarborough. Japanese barberry in particular harbors high density of ticks, and not just ticks, but Lyme infected ticks, by virtue of providing really excellent habitat for the main vector of Lyme disease spread, which is of course the white-footed mouse. And there's some data coming out of the Maine Vector Disease Research Lab that's shown that this is a statistically significant correlation between Japanese barberry abundance and Lyme infected ticks. So there is a human health implication here as well. It is rare that I go into a thick patch of invasives and do not come out crawling with ticks, despite all of my efforts to reduce that risk. They are problematic. They also outcompete native plants in terms of getting attention for pollinators. So that said, that's an ecological benefit. They do provide some food for pollinators. And I think probably most of us here are concerned about the plight of native bees and even bumblebees or honeybees. We've got a pollinator issue that's facing us. So again, they're not totally without ecological benefit. These plants aren't again, not a paved impervious surface, but what we really want is to have native species proliferate and provide food and resources for the plants or for the birds and other wildlife that have co-evolved with them. Something else that's increasingly starting to be evident is that non-native invasive species, when they form very thick monocultures that, like shown in this picture, can provide a barrier to species movement. This could be a PowerPoint, a presentation all on its own. So a wall of invasive plants being a barrier to the northward migration of species whose ranges are responding to climate change is increasingly being documented. And this is especially a problem in the mid-Atlantic, where invasive shrubs are largely precluding tree regeneration. So imagine Maine in 100 years with a climate like Virginia. We want to make sure that tulip poplars can get here. And if it's nothing but wall-to-wall Japanese barberry between Maryland and the New Hampshire border, then we're not going to get tulip poplar up here in time. So there's actually a listserv, the Regional Invasive Species and Climate Change Consortium. There's a whole listserv of academics all around the Northeast that are dedicated to this one particular issue. That includes insects as well, but there's a lot of conversation about how plants are part of the equation. Let's see. All right, so a little bit of a rundown on what invasive means, what's the harm that they do. What I really want to get into, and probably why a lot of you are here, is who are they? Who are these species? What are the ones that are most impactful in Maine? And so this is in no particular order. These are just what came to mind. They're not necessarily all as pernicious, but I will start with one of the most pernicious ones. One of the species that is the most vexing to control and the most hateful is Asiatic bittersweet, sometimes called Oriental bittersweet, but Asiatic is the preferred name. And this is a climbing vine that probably most of you would recognize. If you get off exit 20, is it 22? Get off exit 22 and drive like you're going to Bradbury State Park. So you make a left onto Mallet Drive there. That whole interface, that whole exchange off to your right, just to the south there, is covered in a wall of Asiatic bittersweet. And this species forms a pretty impenetrable thicket. It also, as the vine twines up the trees, it actually strangles the trees, kills them, and then the trees topple over and you just get this mass. It's incredibly prolific. The fruits are bird dispersed. The seeds are fairly long-lived. They can live in the soil, persist in the soil for up to 10 years, and it will grow anywhere. I've seen this growing in full shade, part shade, full sun. I've seen it growing in wetlands, close to standing water on little hummocks. So it's an incredibly adaptable species. Of course, where it does the best, where it's the most prolific, is disturbed forest edge habitat. So when I am walking kind of the interface between fields and woods, this is a species that I commonly see along the edge there. It's been established in New England for about 150 years. As you might imagine, it was brought here as an ornamental. And we have a native species, American bittersweet, which is thought to be on the verge of, if not extinction, at least extirpation, because it hybridizes with Asiatic bittersweet. And so the genetic strain that makes American bittersweet a separate species is getting lost because the Asiatic bittersweet is so much better at reproducing and just a much more aggressive species. So I bet a lot of you on this call have some Asiatic bittersweet that you're dealing with in your properties. It's very, very common. All right, honeysuckles, the shrubby honeysuckles. We have two main species, Morrow's honeysuckle and Tatarian honeysuckle, and they're hard to tell apart, and it's okay. You don't actually need to tell them apart because they are functionally equivalent in terms of the impacts they have. Tatarian honeysuckle, in the photograph on the left of the screen, you can see, I don't know how good the color is showing on your screens, but it's a pinkish flower. And then the one over to the left is what kind of a white and yellow flower. That's Morrow's honeysuckle. So we've got Morrow's on the left, Tatarian on the right, and both of these species produce a fleshy red berry that's shown in the photograph in the middle. And this was also brought here as an ornamental. It has been here for a long time. I frequently see it huge. I've seen, I don't know, 8-inch diameter at the base stems. This is a multi-stemmed shrub that were planted probably 100 years ago by some farmstead. It'll be growing out of a stone wall in the woods. Interesting thing about, or kind of one of the sad things about the shrub honeysuckles is shrubs are great habitat for birds, and robins and other thrushes like to nest in here. And because of the structure of this particular shrub, it's much more woody and basically climbable, the birds that wind up nesting in these species of honeysuckle tend to be more susceptible to nest predation. Now, we do have some native species of honeysuckle, one of which is actually shown growing side by side. So this is American fly honeysuckle. And you can see, again, I apologize, the photograph isn't great, but you can see the leaf tip is a little bit pointier. Both of these species, or all of these species, the leaves are arranged opposite one another. That's a good diagnostic. And if you can't tell whether you have a native species of honeysuckle or an invasive non-native species of honeysuckle, the best way to tell is to take your clippers and clip one of the woody shoots. And if it's hollow on the inside, if the pith is hollow, you'll see kind of a brown circle. And then if it's a bigger stem, that will actually be visibly hollow. That's one of the invasives. So if it's hollow stemmed, it's invasive. If it has a solid stem, then it's a native. And that's a good one. If you think you have it, it's a good one to get online and Google around a little bit, jump on Maine Natural Areas Program's website and just make sure, because the native honeysuckle, honestly, the best way to tell them apart, if you have a giant honeysuckle, like a house-sized honeysuckle, I guarantee you that it's the invasive kind. The native honeysuckle is a lot more delicate. It doesn't ever get really, really big. It won't ever take over. It can form dense patches, but not the way the invasive kind does. So we have two species of buckthorn here in Maine. Both of them look a lot like cherry. They're very easy to confuse with a cherry. And the photograph on the left is one that I took. I shamelessly stole the photograph on the right from the internet without giving whoever took this picture any credit. Sloppy, I know, but I wanted you to be able to see the bark, because back in my woods, I have got probably 4 or 5 inch diameter buckthorn, glossy and common buckthorn, but mostly glossy back in my woods. And if you were looking at it in winter and you don't have an eye for it, you would think that it was either a choke cherry or even a black cherry. So they're very similar. The best way to tell them apart is that the branching pattern or the leaf arrangement pattern on a cherry, a native cherry, is always going to be opposite. So the leaves are going to come out staggered like that. With the buckthorns, they tend to be what's called sub-opposite. So they're almost across from each other. Sometimes they'll be opposite, sometimes they'll be offset slightly. And then, of course, the fruit production on the buckthorns when they're growing in full sun is prolific. It's astounding. These are also gobbled up by birds, and this grows in full shade. The best place to see a truly staggering buckthorn plantation is, besides my own woods, which you're welcome to come hike around in, although I'm making progress, is Prattsbrook Park in Yarmouth. If you've hiked the trails in Prattsbrook Park and you've looked to the left and looked to the right and seen nothing but dank, dense shrubbery for miles, that's buckthorn. And that one there is glossy buckthorn, which is more common than common buckthorn. Purple loosestrife, it's so pretty. Gosh, do I have to dig it out? It's beautiful. The bees love it. People love purple loosestrife. I'm not going to lie, it is a very beautiful plant. It's common in roadside ditches. I years ago wrote a letter to, was it the Forecaster? Because I was driving up where Pownell Road turns into Elmwood Road. I saw a woman on the side of the road with a shovel digging it up to pot it and bring it home. And I had to write a little letter into the editor saying, please don't do this. So this species as a roadside ditchweed isn't a terribly big deal. I mean, it's a roadside, it's already a disturbed area. It's not exactly pristine habitat, but where purple loosestrife gets to be really problematic is when it gets into wetland systems. And when it becomes dominant, and it typically does become very dominant very quickly, it can really crowd out native plant biodiversity. And as we talked about before, you just start to lose your whole ecosystem. So one of the interesting things that's emerged from several years of research is that waterfowl species diversity drops precipitously when you have purple loosestrife taking over emergent wetlands. So the effects of this one kind of ripple on up throughout the ecosystem. This species is incredibly good at producing seed. One of these seed heads can produce hundreds of thousands of seeds. The seeds float, and that's why it spreads through roadside ditches and also through wetland systems, more importantly. Okay, black swallowwort. I don't know how many of you all know black swallowwort. It's relatively new on the scene. And by relatively, I mean, it hasn't been here for 150 years. It's not as aggressive It's locally aggressive, but it doesn't jump from place to place the same way a lot of the other species we've been talking about do. So the picture on the left is a property, Clabbard Island, which is off Falmouth, right across from Handy Boat and Falmouth Town Landing, which is a Maine Coast Heritage Trust preserve and a nice place to take a kayak ride out to or paddle on out to. And there's a lot less of the swallowwort there now, but it's wall to wall, or at least several years ago, it was wall to wall, but it was just in that one spot. There's a couple other places around Casco Bay where I've seen very thick patches of swallowwort, but it's not like bittersweet where you see it everywhere. So if you think you have swallowwort, this is a good one to jump on right away. I think that swallowwort might be a winnable battle, might be something that we can work towards removal from our landscape, whereas something like bittersweet, there's no way we're going to remove all the bittersweet from Maine, but I think swallowwort is a controllable species at this point. Swallowwort is in the milkweed family, and if you look at the picture on the left, you can see long, narrow green pods. And just like common milkweed, those pods dry out and they crack open and the seeds have little feathery bits and they go flying on the wind. The other thing that's particularly pernicious that some of you may have heard about this one is that because it's in the same family as common milkweed, it's kind of a monarch dupe. So monarchs come and they say, oh, this looks about right. And they lay their eggs on the leaves and the caterpillars hatch and it's toxic. So it actually kills monarch caterpillars, which is quite sad story because of course, I think everybody here, there's not a person out there who doesn't care about monarchs. We have another species in North America that's also invasive, that is pale swallowwort. That one is not yet in Maine. It's functionally equivalent. Really, the only difference is the color of the flowers, which is kind of a tawny sort of peach pink color. My arrow button is being sticky. Come on, buddy. There we go. Okay. So garlic mustard, this is a lot more widespread to our south. If you drive through the bucolic fields of Eastern Connecticut and look on the side of the road, this is what you'll see. It's widespread throughout pretty much everywhere but Maine. We have some patches here. I'd be curious if anybody here, maybe chime this into the chat, if anybody knows of any garlic mustard infestations right around here. These pictures are from New York, where I have some family. This is in Westchester County. And we have a couple patches up on a property on Mount Desert Island. I know of a patch in a floodplain forest west of here in Norway, but there's not a ton of garlic mustard in Maine. Unlike the other species we've talked about, which are perennial, garlic mustard is biennial. So it has a 2-year lifespan. And in the first year, what you see are leaves shown in the right-hand photograph. They kind of look like a coltsfoot leaf. They're pretty easy to mistake for coltsfoot, in fact. And then the second year, they shoot up. They kind of rocket up, and that they are in the mustard family. So if you know any of those plant family members, it has a very similar growth form. Little 4-petaled white flowers are the diagnostic. It is edible. People make all kinds of marinades and salad dressings and rubs out of this. And I love eating invasive species. It's a cute thing to do. It might not be a good long-term management strategy, but it's definitely something that you can do. And I see actually somebody chimed into the chat that there was a tiny new patch on Sandy Beach Road pulled last year. We'll check again this year. Thank you. Keep on it. Keep pulling. This, I'm going to talk about control in a little bit, but this is a species that you can successfully eradicate through pulling. The seeds only live about 18 months in the soil seed bank. So if you keep pulling and don't let it go to seed, you can eventually get rid of this as long as the patch is not acres and acres. I don't know why this button isn't working. Here we go. All right, here's one that needs no introduction. Japanese knotweed. This is kind of the poster child for invasive plants. It is a very common sight along the side of the highway. It grows through asphalt. It grows through concrete. When people talk about smothering it with cardboard to control it, I kind of laugh a little bit because I have seen this pop up through asphalt that's been poured on top of it. It's an amazing plant. I think Japanese knotweed has my grudging respect because of its ability to persevere and spread. It is a fantastic source of food for bees. I have friends who are beekeepers who are big into honey and they love Japanese knotweed. So again, it's not without some benefit. When it's young, kind of asparagus shoot aged in size, you can eat it. I've made a coffee cake out of it. Again, it's a little bit of a novelty item, but it can be done. So if you really like coffee cake, have at it, have fun. Let me know how that goes, controlling your Japanese knotweed. This plant, people like to talk about digging it out. This is a tough one. I have seen cross sections of Department of Transportation fill pits, and the root systems can go 20 feet deep. So if you have a very small patch, perhaps you can dig it out. You can certainly do some damage to it by digging, but then you have to be really careful about what you do with that soil. If you have an incinerator, and I know most of us have incinerators on our properties, you know, that's one way to deal with it, but it's easy to spread this by virtue of messing around in the soil. So a tough one to manage. This species, you know, when I see it growing on the side of the highway, I don't get too put out when I see anything growing on the side of the highway, because let's be clear, it's the side of the highway. But when this gets into riparian systems, into floodplains and along riverbanks, that's when it really starts to cause damage. And it can change hydrology of river systems. It can change how water moves through ecosystems. And of course, it changes the habitat structure for all of those river-dependent wildlife species. I think my arrow just needs to be pressed twice. Okay, Japanese barberry. I don't know why this is planted as an ornamental. This was brought here as an ornamental. I just think it's an ugly plant, and I see it and it's like a bad haircut, but I see it in parking lots everywhere. Go figure. It's in to add insult to injury, where Maine Coast Heritage Trust office in Topsom, where I work, it's a hedgerow. I walk past it every day on my way into my office. And one of these days I'm going to snap and go out there with my clearing saw and just take it down to the ground and probably get in a lot of trouble. If you know this species, you know its spoon-shaped leaves are a diagnostic. It also is covered in little tiny spiny thorns. So when people talk about hand pulling invasives, unless you really don't like your volunteers, I do not recommend sending them out to hand pull Japanese barberry. It's not a super tenacious species. And so you can, if you have a few shrubs, you can dig it out. It's not super deeply rooted. And you can also mow it to exhaustion. You hit it with the clearing saw for a few years, and eventually you're going to have a dead barberry. So it's also quite susceptible to low concentrations of the herbicide glyphosate, which I'll talk about in a little bit. I know herbicides are something most of us want to avoid using, or at the very least minimize, but this one, if you have a bottle of Roundup in your hand and you kind of give the plant a dirty look, it tends to keel over. So if you are going to have a bigger infestation to manage and you really want to get it done quickly, and use a very small amount of herbicide, barberry is quite susceptible. So when I have a new property that I have to manage and I go out and I scout for invasives and I find barberry, I think, oh, this isn't so bad. I can deal with this. I can dig this. I can cut it. I can use a little bit of poison. But again, the tick thing is real. I've had Lyme disease twice now. One time, I guarantee you, I got it in a patch of Japanese barberry on an island in Penobscot Bay. So do be careful about that. Nope. Come on, buddy. There we go. Okay. This is another parking lot darling. And when Maine a few years ago passed a ban on the sale, propagation, distribution, or trade of 33 species of non-native invasive plants, this is the one that the green industry, the nursery industry, kind of went crazy over. There is a cultivar of winged euonymus, which is also called burning bush, called Rudy Hague, which if you talk to some old school nurserymen and women, they will swear up and down, it's sterile. Tell you what, nature finds a way. I don't think anything is sterile. And even if 1 in 1,000 seeds is reproductively viable, this will spread. The best place to see burning bush, having gone wild, unfortunately, is an otherwise beautiful Boothbay Region Land Trust preserve called the Ovens Mouth Preserve, which is an absolutely extraordinary place to take a walk, but it's covered in burning bush. The best way to identify this is similar to a honeysuckle. It has these opposite leaves. And then if you look at the bark, if you look at the stem, it's a multi-stemmed shrub. It's got these corky wings, and there's sort of 4 on each corner. It's kind of has almost square in cross section. And of course, it turns this brilliant red in the fall. So yes, it's beautiful. It does escape. This is kind of I don't want to call it a sleeper species, but it's one that a lot of people don't immediately key in on because they don't see it everywhere. But once it gets out of control, it can really cause a problem. Multiflora rose was brought here as an erosion control species, as a hedgerow, as food for bird. It was brought here with the best of intentions, but we all know where the road to hell is paved with, and this, of course, spreads out of control. If you drive down to the Mirror Point public boat launch in Brunswick in June, and you look up to the left and up to the right, and you see sprays of fragrant white flowers 30 feet into the air, that is multiflora rose. We have a lot of native rose species in Maine. None of them have lots and lots of tiny white flowers, and none of them gets 30 feet tall. So if you have a 30-foot tall rose bush growing up the utility pole next to your house and there's white flowers, it's multiflora rose. The best way I like to get rid of this with a backhoe or an excavator, or just it's thorny and you can just kind of grub it out. I have cut my way into the base and put chains around the base of it and put the chain around the ball hitch on a truck and driven it out. So it's one of the ones, it's thorny, but you can use mechanical methods to remove it or manual methods to remove it. Phragmites, not, where was the last time I saw I saw a patch of Phragmites earlier today. Another roadside weed. There's some growing on the side of the highway between the Freeport and the Yarmouth exit on the, let's see, the north side. So if you're southbound, it's on the right. If you see a very tall, sort of beautiful, elegant, waving brownish grass in the fall, it's probably Phragmites. It is a grass. It's a very, very big grass. We also have a native strain. It's the same species, Phragmites australis, but it's a different variety. And our native one has a redder stem. If you see the native species of Phragmites, you'll know it's native because there's just a little bit of it. You don't tend to see these big clumps. The photograph on the right is from a Maine Coast Heritage Trust preserve that's right off of Winslow Park, Lanes Island. And this was what it looked like when we got the island in 2014. And there's probably 2 or 3 stems left now. I've been doing individual cut stem or like clip and drip herbicide application to control this. You can burn it. You can, if you can get to it, you can mow this one to death, but it takes a while. I'd be curious if anybody here has seen yellow iris. This is a relatively new one. It only sort of rose to my attention a few years ago. It's beautiful. I mean, I don't need to tell you that. It's a very lovely thing, but it can spread out of control, and it can particularly spread out of control in sort of wet habitats. So these photographs were taken. I got a tip off from a friend over at the Brunswick Topsom Land Trust that they had some yellow iris they were worried about. So we boated over there and I helped them do a low volume herbicide application to control this as kind of an early strike because there's not a whole lot of it around. Doesn't really need a whole lot of description in terms of identification. If it's an iris and it's all yellow and it's growing in a wild place, it's probably yellow iris, Iris pseudoacorus. This species I hesitated to throw into the mix because I haven't seen it around here, but probably all the better for you folks to be on the lookout for it. Himalayan jewelweed, also called, ornamental jewelweed, also called Himalayan balsam. And I'm sorry, the only photograph I had of this, it's the one on the right, the flower on the right, and it's pink and purple, and sometimes it's white, but it looks very similar to our native jewelweed, spotted touch-me-not, which is the little orange and yellow flower. And here they are growing side by side. This is an annual, so it's a great candidate for hand pulling, or if you want to really get messy and weed whack, you'll wind up covered in green slime, but you can weed whack this. But it produces seeds that, like the spotted touch-me-not, catapult themselves out, and it can spread pretty aggressively through sunny, wet areas. Again, I would also be curious if anybody here wants to throw in the chat if they have seen any ornamental jewelweed in this neck of the woods. These photographs are from Owl's Head. The first place I saw this was out on Matinicus about 10 years ago, and I thought, that doesn't look right. And then I started seeing it everywhere in the mid-coast. So missed opportunity there for some early detection eradication. Autumn olive. Where I see a lot of autumn olive here is in Pownell on Route 9, right around Runaround Pond, the Pownell-Durham line. There's tons of autumn olive up here. This is one, autumn olive I don't lose too much sleep at night over autumn olive. Maybe I should, maybe I'm being naive, but it does provide some habitat, wildlife habitat, and a food source for birds. The berries are quite nutritious. Unlike a lot of the other species that we have been talking about, honeysuckle is junk food for birds, but autumn olive has got a little bit more of a nutritional bang to it. I think that this one is a nitrogen fixer. It's in the olive family. And if somebody knows better, correct me if I'm wrong, that's fact kind of rattling around in my head here. It's much more widespread down in more southerly parts of New England. So the photograph of this old Bronco or whatever it is being overtaken is from Eastern Connecticut. And I've seen thickets, I've seen pastures basically overrun with autumn olive. So it can be troublesome. It certainly can be troublesome. Here, I haven't ever seen it in any great density, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have the potential to become a real problem. And let's see, is this my last one? Okay. Norway maple, I got a few more. We're getting to the end here. Norway maple is all over Brunswick. It kind of looks like a sugar maple. You look at that leaf and you think, yeah, that could pass muster for a sugar maple. But the bark is more furrowed than it is scaly. It almost looks like ash bark. And here's a sugar maple leaf for comparison. If you notice, the sugar maple leaf has really 3 distinct lobes, and the Norway maple has more 5 distinct lobes. The dead giveaway is that if you pull a leaf off, you'll see a milky white sap called latex ooze out of the leaf stem, the petiole, and that's really diagnostic of a Norway maple. Also, we just don't have a lot of sugar maple around here. So if you're walking in the woods and you see something that looks like a whole lot of kind of funky sugar maple, it's probably Norway maple. So those are the nasties. Those are the species that are most common. I'm sure any one of you might have a few other species that you want to add into the mix that are particularly troublesome for you, but these are the ones that from a natural land standpoint, from an ecological damage standpoint, tend to do the most damage. So up until now, this is kind of what I would call merely interesting. And presumably if you're here, you want to know what to do about all this stuff. In general, and this is really lumping here, there are 3 basic modes of control. There's manual removal, which basically means pull it out of the ground. There's mechanical removal, cut it down. Do it a lot, and I call it carbohydrate starvation because you're repeat cutting, you're wearing out the rootstock. And then there's herbicide or poisoning in situ. And very often when I talk about invasive plant control, folks immediately assume that I mean blanketing the earth with Roundup, which is not at all what I mean. I'm going to talk a little bit more about herbicides, but that's really just a piece of the equation and hopefully a small piece. I like to use all of these methods in conjunction with each other. Sometimes I use just one depending on the species and the situation. So manual removal. Pulling and digging can be a good strategy for some species in some circumstances. Other species don't lend themselves particularly well to hand pulling or digging out. I am blessed, as I mentioned, with about 11 acres of buckthorn, and even very small buckthorns are very hard to pull out. Those roots are super tenacious. I have used trucks and tractors and this awful tool called a weed wrench, which is I don't even want to show you a picture of it because its best use is as a doorstop because it's so cumbersome. A shovel is a really good way to dig these things out too, especially one of those long sharpshooter shovels. It can be disruptive. And of course, if you think big picture, what has largely spread these species is soil disturbance. And when you are digging and pulling, you're creating a lot of soil disturbance. And if there's a seed bank there, you could wind up with really fertile ground for the next crop of young invasives popping up after you have removed the grandmother or grandfather. The best way to avoid this is to pull or dig or grub when the soils are damp and the plants are small. As I mentioned, honeysuckle is an exception. You can dig out or pull out or tractor out even very big honeysuckles because it's pretty shallow rooted. We'll go with that. But you want to tamp the soil down after you do that and ideally mulch over it with leaves. So that you don't have as much seed regeneration. Of course, one strategy is to keep tilling to exhaust the seed bank. So you get those seeds to germinate and then you till and kill them and then they more germinate and you till. So that is a strategy that you can use as well. All of these seemingly disparate pictures are different forms of mechanical control or carbohydrate starvation. So cutting, Burning, grazing can wear out. If you do these things repeatedly, it can wear out a perennial plant's root system and eventually lead to the death of that plant. But in most cases, you really have to stay on top of it. You cannot mow Japanese knotweed 3 times a summer and expect it to die back. You need to be mowing it every time you mow your lawn, basically, and you need to plan on doing that for several years, even a fairly small patch. It will definitely take multiple growing seasons to use repeated mechanical control or carbohydrate starvation as a way to kill these plants, but it can be done. Fire is fun. I am a pyromaniac. I love burning, but it's really a better tool to improve access to a site where you're managing invasives. A lot of times land managers will burn Phragmites to get rid of the thatch to stimulate native plants to grow. It doesn't kill the Phragmites, but it helps the native plants that are growing have a better competitive advantage. The picture of me with a funny look on my face on the left, I'm out in a marsh in York or Wells somewhere collecting Galarucella beetles. And if you haven't heard of Galarucella beetles, they're one of the few long time used successful FDA approved biocontrol agents that eat purple loosestrife. So Galarucella beetles, even though they're a biocontrol agent, they work through carbohydrate starvation. They graze down the purple loosestrife and it grows back up, and they graze it down and it grows back up. And that's a good way, a pretty proven way of controlling purple loosestrife. They don't out and out kill most of it, but they sort of stepwise reduce each other's population level. Goats are fun. I wish I could use goats more as a mechanical pretreatment to improve access to a site. Again, the thing about a goat, it's like a weed whacker with a personality. So you can't put goats or sheep or anything like that out on land and take them off and expect your invasives to be gone. You have to graze hard, remove the animals, graze hard, remove the animals, graze hard. So it sounds like a fun solution, but it's pretty labor intensive. You have to contain those goats. And in my experience playing with goats, they will eat everything that they want except for invasive plants if they feel like it. So it's best to start with hungry goats. I want to show you an example of a place that I am using no herbicide and just repeated mechanical treatment to control multiflora rose. This is an old apple tree, and I didn't want to use herbicide here because there's a lot of good stuff growing around here. And fruit trees, there's some other apple trees around. Fruit trees can be particularly sensitive to herbicide damage through drift. And there's a lot of winterberry. It's just a cool site, and I want to preserve as much native plant material as I can. This little apple, or this big old apple tree, was getting swallowed up by multiflora rose. So the first year I went in here with a chainsaw. The second year I came in with a clearing saw, which is like a blade at the end of a kind of a weed whacker thing. And now I'm able to maintain this just with a weed whacker. If you get down on your hands and knees and look on the ground around this apple tree, you'll see little stunted, gnarly multiflora rose growing. And if I took the pressure off, it would start to grow back up. But this is a really good management strategy, a no chemical management strategy. It's gas intensive. So when we're not using herbicide, we tend to be using gasoline and oil. But in this case, I decided that was a better alternative. So I have to keep the pressure on. I think a few more years of repeated weed whacking, and I will probably have eliminated multiflora rose from this site, but I will, of course, keep monitoring. So a little bit about herbicide. I don't want to go too far into I'm not going to say the weeds pun. I'm not going to go too far down the rabbit hole here, but it is a tool in the toolbox. An herbicide is a type of pesticide that's designed to kill unwanted plants. And there are organic herbicides, and there's plenty of natural herbicides like thyme essential oil. Basically, if it has an FDA registration number, then it's an herbicide. People mistakenly refer to vinegar as an herbicide. What they actually are talking about is a 20 to 25% acetic acid solution, which is used as a contact herbicide. I'll talk more about what that means in a minute here. An herbicide or a pesticide cannot be a multicellular organism. So my little Galarucella beetles, those are not technically an herbicide. There are two basic types of herbicide. As I mentioned before, like acetic acid, there's a contact herbicide, which just kills the tissue that it comes into contact with. Contact herbicides are used in agriculture to burn down potatoes before harvest, and in some cases wheat. And they're used, I see people spraying acetic acid on their like stone walkways. you're better off using boiling water because it doesn't cost anything. It kind of achieves the same effect. And then there are systemic herbicides. And typically when we're talking about using herbicides to control invasive plants, we're talking about systemic herbicides. And a systemic herbicide comes into contact with some part of the plant, travels through that plant's vascular system, and kills the plant in situ. So that is to say it kills the entire plant, not just what it comes into contact with. If you want to parse it out a different way, there's another way to classify herbicides. There are selective herbicides and there are non-selective herbicides. A non-selective herbicide kills everything that it comes into contact with. A selective herbicide only kills some types of plants. And generally speaking, kind of in the professional invasive plant world, we tend to use both. Selective herbicides are useful. This is a picture of multiflora rose growing in a pasture. And the herbicide that was used is called triclopyr, which doesn't harm grasses, sedges, rushes, lilies, plants like that. The photograph on the right is a very good example of non-target damage. This is a Japanese barberry shrub that's been treated with glyphosate, which is non-selective. And you can see all the plant, anywhere the spray landed basically is a dead zone now. Typically, the plants or the herbicides that we use in invasive plant management are glyphosate, which is most commonly known as Roundup. There's a lot of generics out there. Triclopyr, which the homeowner version of is an ortho product called Tough Brush. Anything that's labeled to treat poison ivy typically has triclopyr in it. Triclopyr is a selective herbicide, as I mentioned. And then the other two are imazapyr and metsulfuron, and those are really professional, like utility right-of-way vegetation management products. Those aren't anything that I have personal experience in, so I can't speak too much about them. The biggest question is why use them or why not? And you run into a lot of emotion when you talk about herbicides. The way I view it is that I think about relative risk. First of all, I always try to minimize. I try to not use them where I can avoid them. And when I have to use them, I try to minimize them, basically out of the precautionary principle. And the way I think about it is in terms of relative risk. So the relative risk of inaction, non-action, ineffective action on controlling invasive species in ecologically important areas, the relative risk there outweighs the relative risk of small amounts of herbicide use when it's done carefully and strategically. So that's my own personal calculus. I respect anybody's decision not to use herbicides. You don't have to use herbicides to control invasive plants. I will tell you very honestly, it's going to take you longer and it's going to take you more gasoline for the most part, unless you are a goat farmer, in which case, shoot me an email after this. I'd like to talk to you if you're a goat farmer. Let's see. Here we go. So here's how we use herbicides. This is kind of the classic way. I'm standing in a field of Japanese barberry. This is a low volume foliar application, and this is about a 2% solution. Probably I'm using glyphosate. And you basically mix it up with water and spray the plant. The thing you have to be really careful about here is drift, because if you overpressurize your tank, if it's hot, if it's windy, if there's a fog inversion, you can get drift, spray drift. And that's not just wind blowing chemical. That's when the chemical volatilizes and moves and affects something else, non-target damage. So if you're going to go this route, I recommend getting pretty well educated rather than just mixing up a tank and heading out on the next day. There are times when this is appropriate and other times when it's just not precise enough. When you start to get into heavy duty vegetation management, this is what we look at. And there are times when I contract with this company, Vegetation Control Services, out of Athol, Massachusetts, to bring in equipment like this, but it's very rare and it's very expensive. You're looking at about $2,000 a day for a professional spray crew. And hopefully all of you can see what's wrong with this picture. So look at my hands in this slide. Look at this guy. He has no gloves on. He has no protective equipment on. So I'll just point that out. I'm being a little bit smug here, but you do want to make sure that you are following all the precautions on the label if you're going to go the herbicide route. And I'm guessing that, nobody here is looking at an infestation where they're going to be doing this. This is a swallowwort infestation that's just taken over this entire field. So Here are the ways that I like to use herbicide. And these are all methods that take small amounts of concentrated herbicide and put them directly into contact with the plant's vascular system. And I like to do this because I have much less of a risk of drift. It allows me to go in with a scalpel. I can kill one plant at a time. I'm not worried about non-target damage. So these are all probably 25 to 50% solutions, and the species going kind of around the circle clockwise. The purple up there, that's a bittersweet vine that I've treated. And then to the right of that is bundled up Phragmites that I've clipped, and I've sprayed right down into the clipped stems. Down from that is a Norway maple. And then the lower left-hand photograph is individual stem injection of Japanese knotweed. And if you really want to wrestle with the big existential questions of the universe, I recommend doing individual stem injection of Japanese knotweed for 2 to 3 hours. You will question all of your life choices. It's extremely tedious. As a homeowner, this is my go-to. This cool little product is called a buckthorn blaster, and it costs about $20. You can Google it and buy it from some website, some company in, I think, Minnesota makes these. And I love this because I can cut a woody plant and I can use it like a blotter, and I'm not dripping and I'm not spraying, and it gets the herbicide right where I want it. So if you are thinking about going the herbicide route, this is a really good tool that minimizes the risk of error. Herbicides are not a magic bullet. It's not going to be a one and done. It's never a one and done with any kind of invasive species management, and including with herbicides. So year 0, this is that swallowwort infestation that I showed you on Clabbered Island. And this is after 3 years of repeated foliar spray. This is me with the backpack sprayer year after year. I have dramatically reduced the extent. But if you look down, I don't know if I can point with my mouse. If you can see my mouse cursor here, I'm kind of circling funny little stunted leaves. That's residual swallowwort that's creeping back up. So there's always going to be seeds to contend with. And also some plants have herbicide resistant. Bittersweet is somewhat resistant to the herbicide glyphosate. So if you go out with Roundup and you spray bittersweet, what you're probably going to see is that the leaves are going to get kind of yellow and kind of curly. And then the next year it's going to come back fighting. Herbicide, as I mentioned before, alluded to before in the previous slide, it's best used in conjunction with other methods. So mechanical pretreatment, what that means, and this is how I really like to kill invasive plants at work, is to come in with chainsaw, forestry mulcher, clearing saw, even loppers, cut the thing down, wait for it to grow back up, and then spray it with herbicide. And that way I have a much smaller target. I'm using much, much less herbicide, and I've already weakened the plant so I can get better control quickly. I should add that when I'm doing this professionally, the sites that I'm visiting are remote. I might only get to them 2 to 3 times a year, so I want to achieve maximum hurt. On my own property, I don't feel the need to use as much herbicide because I'm out there every day. Every time I go out for a walk with, a pair of loppers or a clearing saw or a chainsaw or just my own 2 hands, I can be inflicting hurt. But if I'm only going to be getting to the site a couple of times, I want to make sure that I'm doing as much damage as I can. Above all, whether you're pulling, digging, spraying, grazing, you want to avoid collateral damage because native plants are the very best defense against invasive plants. That's what this is all about. People tend to get pretty myopic in the invasive plant world. It's this beat the drum, kill the plant kind of zeitgeist that takes over. And it's not about killing the invasive plants. It's about fostering the native plants. So that's just always something to be keeping in mind as you think about what your goals are. This is a cute way if you're going to be using a backpack sprayer or a hand sprayer, put a plastic bag. This plastic bag is covering a sugar maple seedling, and you can spray what you need to. In this case, it's buckthorn and bittersweet, where the vines are just too small to do a cut stem treatment. And this little bag here is protecting my little sugar maple baby. So now for the bad news. You've probably picked up on this by now. Invasive plant management is a long-term, multi-year commitment. No, really, I mean it. Say it with me, people. This isn't a one and done. You're not going to get it done in 1 year unless maybe some of you out there, you have a single buckthorn and you can go out there and you can dig it out, or you can get a buckthorn blaster and do a little stamp of death and be done with it. But the fact is, if you have one, you probably have more, and you should probably look harder. If you have any amount of any invasives load, you're going to be at this for a few years. Before you dive in, it's a good idea to stop and take stock of what your goals are. Are you trying to eradicate it? Do you want to get completely rid of it? Or are you just looking to kind of keep it in check and keep it from producing as much seed? If you have a little bit of one thing and a lot of another thing, control the thing that you only have a little bit of first before it becomes a big problem. I have to come up with budgets. I have to hire contractors. I have to buy equipment. I have to buy chemicals. So I have to come up with a pretty detailed budget and timeline when I do this at work. But it's a good practice for a homeowner to do too. What are you willing to use? You know, what tools do you have? If you were thinking about buying a little electric chainsaw, I just want to put a plug in for these little electric chainsaws. They're great tools for homeowner invasive plant management. I use mine all the time. And then are you going to need to replant? You might. The best way to figure that out is to remove the invasives and see if you have good native stuff coming back in. If you don't, you definitely want to be thinking about a revegetation plan, but you want to make sure you've controlled your invasives. If you go out and you spend 1 year, harassing the bittersweet, and then you plant a bunch of seedling trees in that bittersweet field, you're going to have a heck of a time trying to protect protect that investment of trees from the bittersweet. We're past the prevention point. If you're here, you've already got it, but you can always prevent the infestation of new species. So you want to be monitoring. This is a little bit of a jargony slide, but this is the Forest Service strategy. And this is really what I use in a professional sphere. This kind of assesses what phase of the problem are you at. And you could be in multiple phases, depending on, if you have different species, you might be in an early detection rapid response phase for one species on your property. And you might be in a, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed and, with another species in another part of your property. I throw this in just as kind of it's a nice visual. The best time to start is before you realize you have an issue. A lot of the times people come to me or they call me or they get involved with invasive plant management because they have 2 acres of bittersweet and they've only just noticed it. At that point, you have a big problem and you're looking at many years, probably a fair amount of money, a fair amount of labor, and all the goats in Cumberland County. So if you can get at it before it's really a big problem, that is your best strategy. You want to really hit it hard as soon as you see it. So if you're, and I actually have a coworker who said this, oh, there's just a little bit of barberry. Like, I don't have to worry about it right now. I've got other priorities. No, if you have a little bit of something, that is your biggest priority because that's the battle that you're most likely to win. Where on the landscape these plants are growing also matters. And I come back to the example of Japanese barberry. If you have Japanese knotweed, if you have Japanese knotweed growing along, your road front, yeah, that's too bad. But if you have a stream on your property and you have Japanese knotweed spreading down into your stream, that's a big problem. That's where you want to prioritize it. Prioritize control where the plant is poised to do the most ecological damage. And oftentimes that's spreading into a natural area. With that, I just want to say that I've kind of thrown a lot at you, and there certainly are best practices and ideal timing. But there's a saying about, I think it has to do with pruning apple trees, and the best time to prune is when the shears are in your hand. And that is true for invasive plants as well. Would it be better to do a certain strategy at a certain time of year and be really strategic? Sure. But if you wake up this Saturday morning and you are feeling a fire in your belly and you want to go get after it, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And even if you just reduce the seed production, the seed load that these species create, you're still doing a whole heck of a lot of good. So at this point, I will stop talking and I will say thank you for joining me and thank you for caring. And I'll open it up to chat, question, whatever folks want to do.
Wow, thank you, Amanda. That was a lot of information for sure. And I'm really glad we recorded that because I'm going to have to listen again to capture it all. I didn't notice a lot of questions in the chat, but if anybody does have a question, you can unmute if you'd like.
I see one, somebody asked about black locust.
Oh, yes.
That's it. Black locust. I got in such a fight with a bunch of farmers in New Hampshire one time with the Presumpscot or the Upper Saco Valley Land Trust. I went and gave a talk to them. Black locust is native to the eastern United States. It has moved into Maine. It's been brought into Maine. So it's not native to Maine, but it's here. It's a nitrogen fixer. It definitely has some habitat value. It's a really contentious species. It's not quite as contentious as rugosa rose, which is, we could have a chat just about rugosa rose, but it depends on your perspective whether black locust is invasive or not. I don't worry about black locust. I know some land managers who do.
Great, thank you.
Carrie, do you want to ask, like, do you want me to just go through? Because I see somebody named Aaron has a hand up. Should I call
Oh,
him?
sorry, yes, go ahead.
Okay.
I missed that, sorry.
I see a hand up from Aaron.
Yeah, so I was wondering if you have any strategies about engaging neighbors. I'm pretty committed to our Asiatic bittersweet in our backyard, but our backyard neighbor has a much bigger problem, and it's killing a big white pine, and I just don't know how to help them. If I can just offer to go back and do it for them, or
Offer
what.
to go back and do it for them. I have walked over to my neighbors and knocked on their door and said, hey, can I kill the buckthorn that's on our property line? Because I'm killing all my buckthorn. And they were kind of like, yeah, sure, whatever you want. A lot of times people don't know it's a problem. So I think the best strategy, and I do this professionally too, is if I have an MCHT preserve I'm responsible for, I will often try to get the neighbors involved. And if the neighbors don't want to get involved, I'll ask if I can pull it out or cut it or whatever for them.
Cool, thanks.
Yep, good luck. Ed has an actual hand up.
Yes,
Yes, hey Amanda.
Hey,
My question's on Norway maple. I like big shade trees, and if there's a single Norway maple, is it really that essential to cut it down?
oh, Ed, you asked such a good question. Yes and no. I mean, that single Norway maple in and of itself, taken in a vacuum, isn't causing much damage, but think of all the babies. Where are the seeds going? And this is what I struggle with. And we have MCHT has a property on Swans Island where there are they're gorgeous trees. I love Norway maples. I also hate them. But they are beautiful shade trees. So I guess what I would do in your situation is go out and survey the surrounding forest land. If you have a big Norway maple that's near a natural area, and I don't know if you're thinking about Fells Groves or somewhere in your neck of the woods, but if you have a Norway maple that's near a natural area and you have seedlings coming up in that natural area, I guess you have a couple of strategies. You can accept the presence of Norway maple moving in, because it will. You can try to control the Norway maple seedlings in that natural area and leave the mama tree, or you can take out the mama tree. So it's a competing values thing. It's a tough one.
And if I can ask a more practical question on bittersweet, what I've been doing is waiting until the fall when I can see the leaves start to change color, and I know that the circulation is reversed. And my understanding was that Roundup would go into the root system and kill the plant.
Yes.
You said that, and I've been doing that. So I've been cutting and painting
Yeah.
stems in the fall. But you indicated that Roundup was not terribly effective with bittersweet. Would I be better off just cutting and resigning myself to annual cutting, and that's just a way of life?
No, Ed, you're doing exactly the right thing. So if you have a backpack sprayer or a hand sprayer mixed up with a 2 to 5% solution of glyphosate and you spray the leaves of bittersweet, you're going to wind up with a plant that kind of shrivels up and then pops back. If you can put that herbicide, just like you're doing, directly into contact with that plant's cambium, it's exactly as you said, it's going to translocate down into the roots and you're going to get outstanding results. When I bought my house, I had a bittersweet patch and I went through with my buckthorn blaster and my hand shears and I clipped every vine I could find and I just dabbed it like that. And after 2 years of that, I still have some seedlings I'm pulling out because of the seed load, but that's a great way to kill bittersweet.
Okay, I like what you said about the buckthorn blaster. It's kind of almost like a blotter.
It is. It's great. It's a great little tool.
I've been concerned about going around with a loose container of Roundup.
Yeah, people talk about painting, and if you have an open container and you have a paintbrush, that's a good way, but if you trip, ugh.
Yeah.
I see a hand from Story.
So would that strategy of cutting and buckthorn blaster work on Japanese knotweed?
So yes, it will. And that's, I have the picture that I showed before of a guy named Ron Lemin, who works with Nutrien Ag Solutions. He's my pesticide dealer, and he didn't have gloves on in that picture, but he has this special tool that he's injecting into a Japanese knotweed stem. It's called a JK injector tool. So if you want to make a career out of it, the JK injector tool works really well. But if you don't want to make a career out of it, the buckthorn blaster will work really well. You want full strength concentrated glyphosate. And you want to be, just like Ed said, late summer, early fall is a great time to be doing that treatment because, of course, a perennial woody plant is going to be translocating all of its photosynthetic material down into the roots. So it just sucks it right down. So a buckthorn blaster will work. I've also used a 32-ounce hand sprayer and just very carefully kind of dribbled around the edge.
It's not in my yard yet. It's in the neighbor's yard. And of course, there's the discussion about, could you do this or
Yeah.
can I do it? But, and it grows each year it's a little bigger, which is pretty awful.
Oh, that's discouraging. Good luck.
Well, it is almost 7:45. I know Amanda must be tired, and I'm glad she's taking a sip of water. There was a lot of info, as I mentioned here. So we will share the recording. We will share some of the resources that Amanda shares with us, probably the first of next week, we'll send you. And mark your calendars. We will send an invite out for the field component of this for June 4th at 1 p.m. out at Walsh Preserve. So Amanda, thank you so much for taking time. This is really valuable information that we all need. And I think being out in the field will really also add to that. So thank you all.
Thank you. I'm
Yeah.
so happy to have spent my evening with you. And if you want to have a good time, come out on the 4th. My 6-year-old daughter will be in attendance with me as my sidekick, and she's a hoot.
And she knows her invasives, I bet.
Yes, she does.
Thank you all. Thanks for attending.
Have a good night.
Thanks, Amanda.
You got it.